Wind howled through the splintered gaps of the cabin, carrying the bitter promise of a Dakota winter. Josephine pulled her shawl tighter, trembling not from the freezing draught, but from the heavy, suffocating weight of her own shame. Half her face was ruined, a melted landscape of pale, dead flesh she kept buried beneath thick black wool. She expected disgust. She expected pity. What she didn't expect was the towering, quiet brute of a mountain man standing in her doorway, looking at her as if she were the only whole thing left in a broken world. Cheyenne had been a city of glass and brass, a place where a woman's worth was weighed in the symmetry of her smile and the flawless cut of her silk dresses. Josephine had possessed both. She had been the jewel of the local mercantile elite engaged to a banker whose ambition was only matched by his vanity. Then came the fire at the dressmaker's shop. It started with a knocked-over kerosene lamp. It ended with Josephine pinned beneath a burning rafter, the left side of her face pressed into the scorching floorboards. Survival was a cruel joke. The doctors saved her life, but they could not save her reflection. When the bandages finally came off weeks later, the silence in the hospital room had been deafening. The skin from her left temple down to her jawline was a tight, puckered expanse of angry red and silver scar tissue. It pulled at the corner of her eye. It twisted her mouth into a perpetual slight grimace. Charles, her fiancé, had visited her only once after the unveiling. He stood by the door, his hat clutched to his chest, his eyes fixed firmly on the floral pattern of the wallpaper. He spoke of the weather. He spoke of the railway expansion. He never looked at her. When he left, he placed a heavy velvet pouch of gold eagles on the bedside table. A severance package. A buyout of their shared future. Josephine didn't cry. The fire had burned the tears out of her, leaving only a dry, hollow crater where her naive optimism used to live. Society was a marketplace, and she was damaged goods. People who once crossed the street to greet her now crossed the muddy thoroughfare to avoid her. Mothers pulled their children close when she walked past. The pitying whispers were worse than the overt stares. They sounded like hissing snakes in the pews of the church, in the aisles of the grocer. Such a shame. A monster, really. Best she stays indoors. Who would ever want her now? She bought a heavy mourning veil and pinned it to her bonnet. She packed a single trunk. She took the gold Charles had left her, bought a stagecoach ticket out of Wyoming, and headed north into the unforgiving maw of the Dakota Territory. She didn't want a new start. She wanted to disappear. The property she purchased sight unseen in Bitter Creek wasn't a home. It was a grave above ground. It sat 5 miles outside a rough-shod mining camp, nestled deep in the jagged, pine-choked throat of the Black Hills. The previous owner, a prospector who had died of winter fever, had left behind a sagging log cabin, a rusted axe, and a silence so profound it made Josephine's ears ring. Her first month was an exercise in brutal grinding labor. There was no room for self-pity when the firewood needed chopping and the roof leaked freezing rain onto her narrow cot. She learned to swing the heavy iron axe, her hands blistering, bleeding, and eventually turning to thick, callous leather. She learned to shoot a heavy-bore Henry rifle, the recoil bruising her shoulder deep purple to keep the coyotes away from her meager stores. She wore the veil every single day. Even alone, surrounded only by towering Douglas firs and the indifferent sky, the black lace remained pinned securely beneath her chin. She had covered the single cracked looking-glass in the cabin with a burlap sack. If she didn't see the monster, perhaps it didn't exist. The mountains did not care about her face. The dirt did not judge her when she fell to her knees to plant winter root vegetables. The wind did not whisper about her ruined cheek. Nature was entirely indifferent to her ugliness, and in that harsh apathy, Josephine found a cold, jagged kind of peace. She was a ghost, haunting her own life, resigned to the ash and the iron of the wilderness. She would live here, she would age here, and eventually she would die here, buried by the snow. forgotten by a world that only valued the unblemished, or so she thought. Winter in the Black Hills did not arrive gradually. It attacked. By late October, the golden leaves of the aspens had been violently stripped away by gale force winds. The sky bruised to a permanent heavy slate grey. Josephine watched the temperature plummet, feeling the biting chill seep through the mud-chinked logs of her cabin. She had stacked a formidable cord of wood against the exterior wall, but looking at the encroaching, terrifying darkness of the timberline, she feared it wouldn't be enough. It happened on a Tuesday. The morning was eerily still. The air smelled sharp like ozone and crushed pine needles. Josephine grabbed her tin bucket and made the quarter-mile trek down the steep, rocky embankment to the creek. She needed water before the freeze set in deep. She was halfway back up the incline, the heavy bucket sloshing freezing water onto her woolen skirt, when the sky simply fell. It wasn't snow. It was a wall of white ice driven horizontally by a wind that roared like a derailed locomotive. In seconds the tree line vanished. The cabin vanished. Josephine was instantly blinded, the wind tearing at her heavy coat, stealing the breath directly from her lungs. Panic raw and primal spiked in her chest. She dropped the bucket. It clattered down the rocks, lost to the whiteout. She turned, trying to find her footprints, but the storm had already erased them. The cold was a physical assault, a million tiny knives slicing through her layers. She took a step forward, her boot slipping on an ice-slicked rock. Josephine went down hard. Her knee struck granite. Pain flared hot and bright, cutting through the numbness. She gasped, inhaling a lungful of stinging ice, and choked. She tried to push herself up, but her limbs felt heavy, disjointed. The snow was already piling against her side, inviting her to just lie down, just close her eyes. It would be so easy. A quiet white end to a loud, painful life. A shadow moved in the whiteout. Josephine blinked, her eyelashes frozen together. It was a massive, formless shape at first, like a grizzly bear rising from the snow. Then it took the shape of a man. He didn't yell over the wind. He didn't rush with frantic, useless energy. He moved with a heavy, rooted, deliberate grace, a creature entirely born of the harsh landscape. He wore a heavy coat of patched buffalo hide and thick leather trousers dark with grease and age. A wide-brimmed slouch hat was pulled low over his eyes. He stopped beside her. Josephine shrank back, her instinct to hide overriding her instinct to survive. Her hands scrambled blindly to ensure her heavy black veil was still in place. It was. She was covered. The man knelt. He smelled of wood smoke, raw tobacco, and the deep, rich scent of wet earth. He reached out with hands the size of dinner plates clad in thick fur mittens and grabbed her by the lapels of her coat. With a grunt, he hauled her to her feet as easily as if she were a child's rag doll. She swayed her injured knee, buckling. He caught her waist. His grip was entirely impersonal, steadying her like a fence post. He pointed up the invisible slope. He didn't ask if it was her cabin. He just knew. They walked. Or rather, he walked, and he half-dragged, half-carried her through the snowdrifts that were already knee-deep. The wind screamed an ear-splitting shriek that tore through the pines. Suddenly, a vicious gust caught the edge of Josephine's bonnet. The securing pin snapped. The heavy black veil ripped away, carried off into the white oblivion like a dying raven. The frigid air slammed into her bare face. Josephine screamed, not from the cold, but from the horrifying exposure. She threw her bare, freezing hands over the left side of her face, sobbing in terror. He would see. He would throw her down in disgust. He would leave her to the wolves. The man stopped. He looked down at her. Through the slats of her frozen fingers, through the driving snow, Josephine saw his face for the first time. It was a hard face, a face carved from the same granite they walked upon. Deep lines weathered his forehead and framed his eyes, that were a startling, piercing shade of pale winter sky blue. A jagged, faded scar cut through his own left eyebrow, disappearing into a thick, untamed beard. He looked directly at her hands. He looked at the puckered, ruined flesh visible around the edges of her fingers. His expression did not change. There was no flinch, no widening of the eyes, no pity. Nothing but calm, evaluating stillness. He reached down, took his own heavy wool scarf from around his neck, and wrapped it securely around her head, covering her ears, her cheeks, her scars. He tied it tight. "Keep moving," he grunted. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in her own chest. He didn't wait for her reply. He gripped her arm again and pulled her forward until the dark, solid shape of her cabin materialized from the storm. He kicked the heavy oak door open with one massive boot, shoving her inside out of the screaming wind, and quickly sealed the door shut behind them, throwing the iron latch. The sudden silence inside the cabin was deafening. The interior of the cabin was plunged into freezing gloom. The fire in the hearth had died down to useless orange embers. Josephine stood shivering violently in the center of the room, water pooling around her boots, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. The mountain man took control of the space immediately. He didn't ask permission. He didn't introduce himself. He moved to the hearth, dropping a heavy rucksack from his broad shoulders. He grabbed a handful of dry kindling from her meager pile, pulled a large hunting knife from his belt, and began shaving feather sticks with practiced, terrifying efficiency. Within minutes, a fire was roaring, casting long, dancing shadows against the log walls. "Get out of the wet clothes!" He ordered his back to her as he fed thicker logs into the blaze. Josephine froze, her arms crossed instinctively over her chest. I can't." He paused, glancing over his shoulder. The firelight caught the hard, flat planes of his face. "You'll freeze to death from the inside out, lady. Wet wool kills faster than a bullet. Get 'em off. Wrap in a blanket." He turned his back to her again, giving her privacy, focusing entirely on a cast-iron kettle he pulled from his pack. With shaking, numb fingers, Josephine unbuttoned her heavy coat. She stripped off the soaked outer skirt, and the sodden blouse, her breath hitching in her chest. She grabbed the thickest quilt from her cot and wrapped it tightly around her shoulders, completely burying herself in the heavy patchwork fabric. Only then did she step closer to the fire. She took a seat on the small wooden stool opposite him. He was melting handfuls of snow in the kettle over the flames. "I am Josephine," she managed to say, her voice cracking. It was the first time she had spoken her own name aloud in months. He didn't look up. "Boone." Silence settled over them, broken only by the crackle of the dry pine and the relentless battering ram of the wind against the cabin walls. The storm outside was intensifying, sealing them in. Josephine huddled deeper into her quilt. The scarf he had tied around her head was still there, but it felt terribly inadequate. She kept her chin tipped downward, letting the shadow of her hair hide her left side. She watched him. Boone was a massive man, built like a draft horse. His hands were scored with old nicks and calluses stained with pine pitch and earth. He was utterly relaxed in the hostile environment, leaning back against a support post as he waited for the water to boil. He didn't ask why a woman was living alone in the high country. He didn't ask about her ruined face. His lack of curiosity was unnerving. In civilization, people pried. They demanded the tragedy so they could feed on the drama of it. Boone seemed entirely uninterested in anything that wasn't immediately necessary for survival. The water boiled. He tossed a handful of ground coffee into the kettle, let it steep, and then poured the black, sludgy liquid into a tin mug he produced from his pack. He held it out to her. Josephine reached for it. Her hands were still trembling violently from the cold and the residual shock. Her right hand gripped the mug, but as she brought it toward her chest, a spasm racked her shoulders. The tin mug slipped. It hit the hearthstone with a sharp clatter. Boiling black coffee splashed across the stones, hissing violently as it hit the hot ashes. Josephine gasped, jumping back. "I'm sorry," she stammered, panic rising instantly. "I'm so sorry, I'll clean it." "Leave it," Boone said. But the dam had broken. The dropped mug was the final pathetic failure in a long line of miseries. The cold, the near death in the snow, the loss of her veil, the terrifying presence of this huge stranger, it all collided in her chest. She dropped to her knees, clutching the quilt tight against her face, pressing the fabric against the scarred ruin of her cheek. A sob tore from her throat, a harsh, ugly sound. She curled inward, making herself as small as possible on the hard dirt floor. She was crying for the life she lost in the fire. She was crying for the isolation. She was crying because she was so incredibly, deeply tired of hiding. "I'm a monster!" She wept the words, muffled by the heavy quilt. "Don't look at me. Please just don't look at me." She expected him to shift uncomfortably. She expected him to offer hollow, awkward platitudes, or worse, to step out into the storm to get away from her hysteria. Instead, she heard the heavy scuff of his boots on the stone. Boone knelt in front of her. His massive presence blocked the heat of the fire. Josephine flinched, shrinking back against the legs of her cot, burying her face deeper into her hands. "Don't. Look at me," Boone said. It wasn't a request. It was a low, steady command. She shook her head frantically. Slowly, deliberately, Boone reached out. His large, rough hands clamped over her wrists. His grip was completely unyielding, yet entirely devoid of cruelty. With slow, irresistible force, he pulled her hands away from her face. Josephine squeezed her eyes shut, turning her head violently away, bracing for the sharp intake of breath, bracing for the recoil. It never came. Boone released her wrists. He lifted his hand. A thumb calloused like old leather, and smelling of wood smoke brushed lightly against the edge of her jaw. He touched the tight, puckered skin of the burn scar. He didn't trace it with morbid curiosity. He just touched it, acknowledging it was there, as casually as he might acknowledge a knot in a piece of pine wood. Josephine's breath hitched. She slowly opened her eyes. Boone was looking right at her, right at the scar. His pale blue eyes were entirely calm. There was no revulsion. There was no pity. There was only a profound, grounded recognition of her survival. He saw the violence that had been done to her, and he simply accepted it as part of the terrain. He didn't tell her she was beautiful. He didn't offer a flowery lie to soothe her ego. He knew the world was brutal. He wore its marks on his own face. His hand dropped from her cheek to rest heavily, comfortingly on her trembling shoulder. "You're safe," Boone murmured, his voice like gravel grinding together underfoot. "You're with me." For the first time since the fire, Josephine believed it. The cold inside her finally began to thaw. The blizzard did not break the next morning. It settled over the Black Hills like a suffocating white blanket, howling with a relentless mechanical fury. Josephine woke to the smell of rendered fat and chicory coffee. She was still wrapped tightly in her heavy quilt on the narrow cot. The fire was roaring, driving back the bitter damp that usually clung to the cabin walls. Boone was already awake. He sat cross-legged on the packed dirt floor near the hearth, methodically running an oiled rag over the disassembled parts of a heavy Sharps rifle. She lay perfectly still, her breath shallow. The events of the previous day rushed back in a jarring sequence, the whiteout, the fall, the tearing of her veil, his thumb on her ruined cheek. "You're safe. You're with me." Instinct flared. Her hand shot up to her face, fingers searching for the heavy black lace that wasn't there. She touched the puckered ridge of skin near her temple instead. She was exposed. The morning light filtering through the snow-caked window panes was grey and unforgiving, offering no shadows to hide in. She waited for him to look up. She waited for the grimace, the polite aversion of his eyes, the subtle shift in posture that told her she was hard to look at. Boone snapped the rifle's breech closed with a heavy metallic clack. He didn't look at her. Coffee's hot, he said to the fire. Biscuits in the skillet. He stood leaning the rifle against the doorframe and walked to the small wash basin. He splashed freezing water on his face, his broad back, to her entirely unbothered by her presence or her face. Slowly, Josephine pushed the quilt aside. She wore only her woolen underdress, her heavy skirts still drying on a chair near the hearth. She felt painfully vulnerable. She walked to the fire, keeping her head slightly bowed, her left shoulder angled away from him. She poured a cup of the black, bitter coffee and took a hardpan biscuit from the cast-iron skillet. She sat on the wooden stool. Boone took a seat on a crate opposite her. He ate with the mechanical efficiency of a man who viewed food strictly as fuel. Josephine chewed the dry biscuit. The silence stretched. In Cheyenne, silence was a weapon. It was used to judge, to exclude, to punish. Here the silence was just quiet. It had no agenda. The storm. Josephine ventured, her voice raspy from disuse and the lingering smoke in the cabin. How long will it last? Boone looked at the frosted window. 3 days, maybe 4. High pressure trapped against the ridge. And your home, your camp. He looked back at her. His pale blue eyes were steady. He didn't look at her good right side. He looked at the center of her face, taking in the whole of her without flinching. I go where the trapping is good. Set up a lean-to a few miles north of here last week. It's under 10 feet of drift by now, so you are stuck here. It wasn't a question. It was an apology. We are stuck here, he corrected flatly. He finished his coffee and set the tin mug down. Wood's holding. Rations are tight but sufficient. We ride it out. He didn't complain. He didn't sigh heavily or act burdened. He simply stated the facts of their survival. The next 3 days stripped away the remaining artifice of Josephine's former life. You could not maintain societal shame when you were sharing a space the size of a large wagon with a stranger using a bucket behind a canvas sheet and eating beans from the same tin pot. She stopped hiding her face. It was exhausting, and more importantly, it was entirely unnecessary. Boone didn't care. He watched her chop vegetables with the same neutral observation he used to watch the fire. When she dropped a piece of firewood on her toe and let out a vicious, unladylike curse, the corner of his mouth twitched beneath his thick beard, but he said nothing. They fell into a rhythm. Boone handled the heavy labor, reinforcing the door against the wind, checking the roof for stress fractures, sharpening the axes. Josephine handled the interior. She mended a massive tear in his buffalo coat, her small, scarred fingers working the heavy bone needle through the thick hide with surprising strength. On the 3rd night, the wind stopped screaming. The sudden absence of noise was deafening. The cabin felt entirely cut off from the universe, a wooden capsule suspended in a void of white. Boone was whittling a piece of soft pine by the fire. Josephine was brushing out her hair. She had taken to leaving it unpinned, the heavy dark waves falling over her shoulders. She paused, the brush caught in a tangle, and watched him. The firelight threw sharp, dancing shadows across his scarred brow. How did you get it? She asked quietly. She had never asked anyone a personal question since the fire. She assumed it was forbidden territory, just as her own face was. Boone didn't stop carving. The knife peeled away a long, curled ribbon of wood. Which one? The one above your eye. He reached up, brushing the thick, raised line of white scar tissue that cleaved his eyebrow in two. A cornered elk. 7 years ago up in the Bighorns. Antelope Tine caught me as he went down. He blew the wood shavings off his lap. Taught me not to rush a dying thing. He looked up at her. He didn't ask her about hers. He already knew. The whole territory knew the story of the Cheyenne heiress who burned. He didn't offer pity. He offered a nod. A mutual recognition of the violent tax the world demanded from those who lived in it. It healed well, Josephine said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Boone closed his pocket knife with a sharp snap. Scars don't matter to the mountain, Josephine. They just prove you didn't let the bastard kill you. Dawn broke like cracked ice, pale, sharp, and blindingly bright. The storm had passed, leaving behind a frozen, paralyzed world. The snow was piled halfway up the cabin's single window. The temperature had plummeted overnight, the air so cold it felt brittle, capable of snapping if you moved too quickly. Boone was geared up before the sun fully cleared the jagged peaks. He wore his heavy buffalo coat, the tear Josephine had mended, now a seamless, strong scar of thick sinew. He had his snowshoes strapped to his boots, and the heavy Sharps rifle slung over his shoulder. "I need to dig out the woodpile and check the perimeter," he set his hand on the iron door latch. "Don't open this door unless you hear my voice. Keep the fire hot." Josephine nodded, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Be careful." He gave her a single curt nod and pushed the door open. A wall of snow collapsed inward. Boone grabbed a shovel, cleared the threshold, and stepped out into the blinding white. He pulled the door shut behind him. The cabin felt instantly colder without him. Josephine moved to the hearth, feeding 3 heavy logs into the flames. She walked to the window, scraping a small hole through the thick frost with her fingernail. She could see Boone's broad back as he waded through waist-deep drifts toward the cord of wood stacked against the far side of the cabin. He moved like a snowplow sheer brute force parting the white sea. He began to shovel, throwing huge, glittering arcs of snow into the air. Josephine watched him, a strange, tight knot forming in her chest. It wasn't fear. It was an unfamiliar, terrifying sense of attachment. She had spent a year trying to sever all ties to humanity, and in 3 days this silent, scarred giant had anchored her back to the earth. Then the shadows at the tree line moved. Josephine narrowed her eyes, squinting through the scratched glass. The pine forest was a wall of black and dark green. At first she thought it was the wind knocking snow from the branches. But the wind was dead. 4 distinct shapes detached themselves from the timberline. They were low to the ground, moving with a fluid, terrifying grace over the top of the snow crust. They weren't white. They were a mottled, dirty grey. Wolves. They were massive timber wolves, driven down from the high ridges by the blinding storm, their ribs starkly visible against their gaunt flanks. They were starving, desperate, and hunting in daylight. Boone had his back to them. The rhythmic scraping of his iron shovel against the frozen ground masked the silent approach of the pack. Panic spiked in Josephine's throat, tasting like copper. She slammed her hand against the glass, shouting his name, but the thick, ice-caked panes muffled the sound entirely. He didn't turn. The lead wolf, a massive male with a torn ear, dropped its head, picking up the pace. The other 3 fanned out, executing a flawless, lethal flanking maneuver. They were 30 yards out. 25. Josephine didn't think. The paralyzing fear that had defined her life since the fire simply evaporated, burned away by a sudden violent surge of adrenaline. She turned from the window and lunged for her cot. She reached underneath her fingers, closing around the cold steel barrel of her heavy-bore Henry repeating rifle. She hauled it out, checked the brass receiver, and racked the lever. The heavy .44 caliber cartridge slid into the chamber with a satisfying, deadly click. She ran to the door, threw the iron latch, and kicked it open. The freezing air hit her lungs like shattered glass. She stepped out onto the cleared porch, the snow glaring so fiercely she had to squint. "Boone!" She screamed, her voice tearing through the frozen silence of the valley. Boone spun around, dropping the shovel. He saw Josephine first standing on the porch, the heavy rifle braced against her shoulder. Then he followed her eye line. The alpha wolf lunged. It cleared the snowdrift in a massive grey blur, jaws snapping for Boone's throat. Boone twisted, bringing his heavy fur-clad forearm up just in time. The wolf's jaws clamped down on the thick buffalo hide, its momentum throwing Boone backward into the deep snow. The remaining 3 wolves broke into a dead sprint. Josephine exhaled her breath, pluming white in the air. She didn't see the ruined face in her peripheral vision. She didn't feel the biting cold on her bare cheeks. She only saw the front sight of the Henry rifle settling squarely on the chest of the wolf approaching Boone's exposed left side. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared, bucking violently against her shoulder. The concussive boom echoed off the mountain walls like thunder. The heavy lead slug caught the wolf mid-stride, dropping it instantly into the snow, a spray of crimson painting the pristine white. Boone roared. With a violent heave of his hips and shoulders, he rolled the alpha wolf underneath him. He drew the heavy hunting knife from his belt in a flash of steel, driving it deep into the animal's ribs. The wolf thrashed once and went limp. Josephine cranked the lever of the Henry, ejecting the smoking brass casing. It chimed against the wooden porch. She swung the barrel toward the third wolf, which had skidded to a halt at the deafening sound of the gunshot. She fired again. The bullet clipped the wolf's shoulder. It yelped, spinning in a tight circle before scrambling desperately back towards the tree line. The fourth wolf didn't hesitate. It abandoned the hunt entirely, disappearing into the dark pines. Silence slammed back down onto the clearing, ringing in Josephine's ears. The heavy smell of black powder and copper hung in the freezing air. Boone slowly pushed himself up from the snow. He stood over the dead alpha, his chest heaving, his breath tearing in ragged white clouds. The heavy buffalo coat was shredded at the forearm. He didn't look at the dead wolves. He looked up at the porch. Josephine stood there, the heavy rifle lowered, still smoking slightly. Her hair was whipping wildly in the sudden slight breeze. Her face, scarred bare and fierce, was set in stone. She wasn't trembling. Boone wiped a smear of blood from his cheek with the back of his hand. He looked at the wolf she had dropped 10 feet from his blind side. Then he looked back at her. He gave her a slow, deep nod. "Good shot," he rasped. The interior of the cabin smelled of iodine boiling water and the lingering, acrid tang of gun smoke that clung to Josephine's wool dress. Boone sat on the wooden stool by the fire, his buffalo coat discarded on the floor. He had stripped off his heavy flannel shirt. His torso was a map of old violence, faded white lines crisscrossing heavily muscled, sun-browned skin. But Josephine wasn't looking at the old scars. She was focused on his left forearm. The alpha's teeth had pierced the thick hide of the coat, sinking deep into the meat of Boone's arm. It wasn't an arterial bleed, but it was ugly. 4 deep, jagged puncture wounds oozed dark blood. "Hold still," Josephine ordered softly. Boone didn't flinch. He watched her. She had a clean strip of cotton cloth soaked in a basin of scalding water and coarse lye soap. She pressed the steaming cloth directly into the punctures to clean out the animal saliva and dirt. It had to be agonizing. Boone's massive bicep flexed the tendons in his forearm, standing out like steel cables, but his expression remained entirely blank. He didn't make a sound. "You should have yelled," Josephine reprimanded, her voice tight as she scrubbed the wound. "You should have kept a lookout." Wind was dead, couldn't smell 'em. Snow muffled their footfalls. Boone said quietly. He wasn't defending himself, he was analyzing the tactical failure. He looked at her hands. Her fingers, though calloused and scarred on the left side, moved with deft, gentle precision. "You covered my blind side. I owe you my life." Josephine stopped scrubbing. She looked up. Their faces were mere inches apart. She could see the individual specks of grey in his pale blue eyes. She could smell the cold and the iron on his skin. "You pulled me out of the blizzard," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "We are even." "No." Boone said, his voice a low rumble. "We're not." He reached out with his uninjured right hand. He didn't touch her face this time. He touched her left hand, the one holding the bloody rag. He gently pried the cloth from her grip. His large, rough fingers enveloped hers, tracing the tight, burned skin on the back of her knuckles. Josephine's breath caught in her throat. She tried to pull away a phantom reflex of her old shame, but his grip was firm. Not trapping her, just holding her. Grounding her. You fought for me. Boone said slowly, his eyes locked onto hers. Most people would have bolted the door and prayed. You stepped out into the cold and pulled the trigger. You were going to die. I was. He released her hand and picked up the bottle of raw, clear moonshine he kept for medicinal purposes. He unstoppered it with his teeth, spat the cork onto the floor, and poured a generous splash directly over his open wounds. He hissed slightly through his teeth, his jaw clenching as the alcohol burned away the remaining impurities. Josephine grabbed a dry, clean bandage and began wrapping his forearm tightly, pulling the fabric taut to close the punctures. When she finished, she tied it off with a neat, secure knot. She stepped back, putting distance between them, suddenly overwhelmed by the intense, suffocating heat radiating from his bare chest. She turned away, walking toward the far corner of the cabin. The single looking-glass still hung on the wall. For over a year, a burlap sack had been nailed over it. Josephine stood before it, her back to Boone. She reached up, gripped the rough fabric of the sack, and ripped it down. Dust motes danced in the shaft of sunlight cutting through the window. Josephine looked at herself. Truly looked. She saw the tangled, wild mess of her dark hair. She saw the dark circles of exhaustion under her eyes. She saw the right side of her face, smooth pale, the ghost of the Cheyenne heiress. And she saw the left side, the puckered, silvered landscape of ruined flesh that pulled at her eye and twisted her lip. It was ugly. It was brutal, but for the first time, she didn't see a monster. She saw a woman who had survived a fire. She saw a woman who had survived a year alone in the Dakota wilderness. She saw a woman who had just stared down a charging timber wolf and held her ground. She heard the heavy tread of Boone's boots on the dirt floor. He came up behind her. He didn't crowd her, stopping a foot away, but his massive presence filled the reflection in the glass. He looked at her reflection. He looked at the scarred left side of her face in the mirror. Then his eyes flicked to meet her right eye in the glass. You spend too much time looking at what the fire took, Boone said quietly, his deep voice vibrating in the small space. It took everything, she whispered, her hands gripping the edges of the washstand. No! Boone reached forward, his large hands resting heavily on her shoulders. The heat of his palms seeped through the wool of her dress. It just burned away the weak parts, left the iron behind. Josephine leaned back just an inch, letting her weight rest against his solid chest. She closed her eyes. The howling wind was gone. The whispering voices of Cheyenne society were gone. There was only the crackle of the fire, the smell of gun smoke, and the steady, unyielding heartbeat of the mountain man at her back. She didn't need a veil anymore. She didn't need to hide. The wilderness had broken her down, but it had also forged her into something entirely new, something strong enough to survive the winter, something strong enough to be seen. The ice didn't retreat. It surrendered violently. March brought a brutal, tearing wind from the south that stripped the Black Hills of their white armor. The snowmelt turned the slopes into treacherous sliding rivers of thick brown mud. The creek at the bottom of the embankment, silent for months, transformed into a roaring, frothing monster that tore young saplings from their roots. Inside the cabin, the survival dynamic had shifted. The wolf bite on Boone's arm had scabbed over thickly, but the animal's saliva had left a poison in his blood. 2 weeks after the blizzard broke, the mountain man collapsed. He didn't complain of a headache or a chill. He simply walked through the door carrying a load of firewood, set it down precisely on the hearth, and folded onto the dirt floor like a felled oak. Josephine dragged his dead weight onto the cot. For 6 days and 6 nights a vicious fever burned through him. He sweat through the heavy blankets. He thrashed in the grips of dark, violent delirium, muttering about high country snow blinds and men buried under rock slides. He was terrifying in his vulnerability. This massive, immovable force of a man was suddenly fragile, reduced to shivering flesh and ragged breathing. Josephine didn't panic. The weeping, trembling girl from Cheyenne was dead buried somewhere out in the snow alongside the timber wolves. In her place was a woman forged of iron and ash. She stripped the heavy buffalo coat from him. She boiled willow bark she had harvested from the creek bank before the deep freeze, forcing the bitter, dark tea down his throat cup by cup. When he shivered so violently the cot groaned, she climbed in beside him, fully clothed, wrapping her arms around his broad, burning chest to anchor him to the earth, pressing her scarred face against his shoulder. She didn't sleep. She kept the fire burning. She fed him broth made from the tough, stringy meat of the wolves. She wiped the sweat from his forehead with a cool rag. On the morning of the 7th day, the fever broke. Boone opened his eyes. They were sunken, ringed with dark, purple exhaustion, but the pale blue clarity had returned. He looked at the log ceiling. He looked at the roaring fire. Then he turned his head and looked at Josephine. She was sitting on the wooden stool, her head resting against the side of the cot, her eyes closed. Her face was bare. The brutal, puckered scar tissue was fully exposed to the harsh morning light. She looked exhausted, hollowed out, and entirely beautiful to him. He shifted his heavy arm, letting his calloused hand drop over the side of the cot until his fingers brushed her knee. Josephine jolted awake, her right hand instinctively flying towards the Henry rifle leaning against the wall. Then she saw his open, lucid eyes. She let out a long, shuddering breath, pressing the heels of her hands into her eyes. "You are a profoundly stubborn man. Takes one to know one." Boone rasped. His voice sounded like dry gravel being crushed under a wagon wheel. He sat up slowly, the muscles in his back trembling with the effort. He swung his legs over the side of the cot, planting his boots on the dirt floor. He looked down at his left arm. The deep punctures were angry and red, but the black rot of infection was gone. "You pulled me back," he said flatly. "You owed me a debt for the blizzard." Josephine replied, her tone matching his. "I was collecting." Boone offered a low, breathless chuckle that ended in a cough. He reached out and gripped her chin. He didn't avoid the scarred left side. His thumb rested directly over the tight, shiny flesh near her jawline. He held her gaze, a silent, heavy exchange passing between them that required no poetry, no declarations. It was a mutual recognition of shared blood and shared survival. The intimacy of the winter had bound them together like tree roots wrapping around bedrock. They didn't talk about the past. They didn't talk about Cheyenne or the Bighorns or the lives they had left behind. They only talked about the depth of the mud, the trajectory of the deer tracks, and the amount of salt pork left in the barrel. But the thaw brought more than just mud and sunlight. It brought the world back to their doorstep. It was late April when the isolation shattered. The mud had finally dried into a hard, rutted crust. Josephine was in the small patch of turned earth behind the cabin, dropping seed potatoes into the trenches she had dug by hand. The sun was warm on her back. She wore a simple cotton dress, the sleeves rolled up past her elbows, her hands black with soil. Boone was a mile away scouting the upper ridge for signs of early spring elk. She heard the horses first, the heavy, sloppy suction of hooves pulling out of the creek mud. Josephine stood up slowly, her spine stiffening. She wiped her hands on her coarse apron. 3 riders crested the embankment. They rode mangy, underfed geldings. The men themselves looked like they had been chewed up and spat out by the winter. They wore filthy canvas coats, battered bowler hats, and a thick crust of grime. Miners from the Bitter Creek camp. They reined in their horses at the edge of the clearing 30 yards from the cabin. The leader, a wiry man with a face like a hatchet and a mouth full of rotted teeth, leaned forward in his saddle. He spat a thick stream of black tobacco juice into the dirt. "Well now," the man called out, his voice a sharp, nasal whine. "Looky here, a domestic scene in the middle of nowhere." Josephine didn't move. She didn't run into the cabin. She stood firmly in the dirt, her chin raised. She let them see her. She let them look at the left side of her face. The second man, a heavy-set brute with a scraggly red beard, pointed a thick, dirty finger. Christ almighty, Cobb, look at her face. Looks like a melted wax candle. The men laughed. It was a cruel, scratching sound that cut through the quiet of the pines. A year ago, that laughter would have sent Josephine running for the shadows, sobbing into her heavy black veil. Now it just made her feel cold. A deep, calculating cold. State your business and move on. Josephine called out, her voice carrying clear and hard across the clearing. Cobb, the hatchet-faced man, stopped laughing. He spurred his horse forward a few paces, his eyes narrowing as he took in the cabin, the stacked wood, the curing pelts. And then he looked back at Josephine. Recognition flared in his dark, rat-like eyes. "Wait a minute," Cobb said, slowly sliding down from his saddle. His boots hit the dirt with a heavy thud. "I know who you are. The boys down at the assayer's office talked about you last fall. The burned-up heiress from Cheyenne. Came up here to hide from the world." Cobb took a step closer, unholstering the heavy Colt revolver at his hip and letting it hang casually at his side. "They also said you brought a heavy velvet bag of gold eagles with you." Cobb grinned, showing his ruined teeth. "Severance pay from that fancy banker. Now a deformed thing like you don't have no use for gold up here in the dirt. But me and my boys, we had a hard winter. We could use a grubstake. There is no gold here." Josephine lied, her voice steady. The pouch was buried beneath the floorboards under the hearth. "Get back on your horse." "I don't think I will," Cobb sneered. He took another step forward. The other two men dismounted, drawing their own weapons, fanning out slightly. "I think we'll just go inside and tear this little shack apart. And if you get in the way, well, wouldn't want to mess up your pretty side, would we?" Josephine's eyes flicked to the cabin door. The Henry rifle was inside, resting against the wall. 10 feet away. Too far. She gripped the heavy, dirt-caked iron trowel in her right hand. It wasn't a rifle, but it was heavy, and the edge was sharp. She braced her feet in the soft earth. She wasn't going to hide. She wasn't going to surrender her home. "You take one more step toward this cabin," Josephine said, her voice dropping to a deadly quiet register, "and you will die in this mud." Cobb laughed again, a harsh barking sound. He raised the Colt. "Feisty little monster, ain't she?" A shadow detached itself from the tree line behind them. "Drop it." The voice didn't boom. It didn't shout. It rolled across the clearing like the low, terrifying rumble of an impending avalanche. The 3 miners froze. Cobb spun around, his Colt raised. Boone stepped out from the heavy timber. He didn't have his Sharps rifle. He had leaned it against a pine tree 50 yards back so he could move silently. He held nothing but the massive, bone-handled hunting knife in his right hand. His buffalo coat was open, revealing the thick leather suspenders and the heavy chest beneath. He looked like the mountain itself had taken human form and decided it was angry. The red-bearded miner took a step backward, his boots sliding in the mud. "Jesus, Cobb, that's a big boy." Cobb swallowed hard, but the greed in his eyes outweighed his fear. He aimed the Colt squarely at Boone's chest. "Keep out of this, mountain man. This ain't your business. This freak has gold. We take it, we split it, we leave. You can find yourself a prettier piece of tail down in Deadwood." Boone didn't break stride. He walked toward Cobb with a slow, relentless, heavy gait. The pale blue of his eyes had gone entirely flat. There was no anger in his face. There was only a chilling mechanical intent to dismantle the threat. "I said drop it," Boone repeated. "I'll put a hole in you." Cobb screamed, his finger tightening on the trigger. The crack of the gunshot was deafening, but Cobb's aim was rushed. The heavy point .45 caliber lead slug tore through the meat of Boone's left shoulder, clipping the fabric of his shirt. Boone didn't stop. He didn't even flinch. The momentum of his massive frame carried him forward. Before Cobb could cock the hammer for a second shot, Boone was on him. It wasn't a fight. It was a slaughter. Boone's left hand shot out, grabbing the barrel of the Colt. He didn't try to wrestle it away. He simply twisted it, forcing the barrel violently upward. The metal snapped the bones in Cobb's wrist with a wet, sickening crunch. Cobb shrieked, dropping the gun. Boone drove the heavy brass pommel of his hunting knife directly into the bridge of Cobb's nose. The bone shattered instantly. Cobb collapsed backward into the mud, screaming, blood pouring down his throat instantly out of the fight. The red-bearded man raised his revolver, aiming frantically at Boone's broad back. "No!" Josephine roared. She didn't run away. She charged. She closed the 10 feet between them in a heartbeat, lunging forward with the heavy iron trowel. She drove the rusted, dirt-caked point directly into the red-bearded man's thigh, burying it to the handle. The man howled his shot, going wide into the dirt. He dropped his gun, clutching his leg, falling to his knees in the mud. The third miner, a young kid who looked barely 18, stood frozen by the horses, his hands trembling violently. He looked at Cobb, writhing on the ground. He looked at the red-bearded man, bleeding out into the mud. He looked at Boone, turning slowly toward him, the bloody knife held low. And then he looked at Josephine. She stood over the red-bearded man, her chest heaving the left side of her face, a mask of terrifying, unyielding fury. She wasn't a victim. She was the apex predator of this clearing. The kid dropped his gun. He threw his hands in the air, backing away slowly. "I didn't want no part of this." He stammered, tears tracking through the dirt on his face. "I didn't want no part." Boone stepped over Cobb's moaning body. He picked up the dropped Colt and pointed it at the kid. "Load your friends." Boone said, his voice completely hollow. "Throw them over the saddles. If I see your faces on this ridge again, I won't use the pommel. I'll use the blade, understand?" The kid nodded frantically. He rushed forward, dragging the sobbing, bleeding, red-bearded man toward his gelding, heaving him over the saddle. Then he went for Cobb, dragging the unconscious leader through the mud and throwing him over his horse like a sack of grain. The kid mounted his own horse, grabbing the reins of the other two. He didn't look back as he spurred the gelding into a panicked gallop, tearing back down the embankment, disappearing into the timberline. Silence rushed back into the clearing, heavy and thick. The only sound was the wind in the pines and the harsh, ragged breathing of the two survivors. Boone stood in the center of the muddy yard. He looked down at his left shoulder. The fabric of his shirt was torn, a thick ribbon of dark blood sliding down his bicep. It was a flesh wound clean through the meat, missing the bone. He turned and looked at Josephine. She was standing near the garden plot, staring at the blood on her hands. The adrenaline was draining out of her, leaving a cold, trembling void in its wake. She dropped the heavy iron trowel. It hit the dirt with a dull thud. She had almost killed a man. The realization didn't fill her with horror. It filled her with a terrifying, profound clarity. She would do it again. She would tear the throat out of anyone who tried to take this life from her. Anyone who tried to take him from her. Boone walked toward her. He didn't care about his bleeding shoulder. He reached her, stopping inches away. His large, calloused hands came up, framing her face. He didn't touch just the good side. His thumbs rested firmly, deliberately on both her cheeks, anchoring her to him. "Look at me," he commanded softly. Josephine lifted her eyes. They were wide, dark, and swimming with unshed tears. "You stood your ground." Boone said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed to surface. It was awe. "You didn't run." "This is my home," Josephine whispered fiercely, her voice cracking. "They have no right to it. They have no right to us." Boone's jaw tightened. The muscle in his cheek feathered. "No, they don't." The evening sun sank behind the jagged peaks of the Black Hills, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and bleeding orange. Inside the cabin, the heavy iron latch was thrown on the door. The fire was burning low, casting long, intimate shadows across the rough-hewn logs. The smell of gun smoke and mud had been scrubbed away, replaced by the scent of boiling water carbolic soap and roasting coffee. Boone sat shirtless on the edge of the cot. Josephine stood beside him. tightly binding the gunshot wound on his shoulder with clean white linen. She pulled the bandage taut, tying it off with practiced, gentle efficiency. Neither of them had spoken much since the men rode away. The violence of the afternoon hung in the air, not as a trauma, but as a finalized contract. They had bled for this ground. They had bled for each other. Josephine stepped back, wiping her hands on a clean towel. She looked down at him. Boone's massive chest rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm. He looked tired, older than his years, but deeply, fundamentally anchored. She turned away, walking to the small wooden table. She poured 2 cups of coffee, her hands finally steady. "The pass will be completely clear in 2 weeks," Josephine said to the wall, her voice tight. It was the question that had been gnawing at the base of her skull since the fever broke. Boone didn't answer immediately. He picked up his shirt, slowly pulling it over his injured shoulder, buttoning it with one hand. "The snowmelt is fast this year," he finally said. Josephine closed her eyes. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. Here it comes, she thought. The practical reality. He is a mountain man. He belongs to the high country, to the solitary ridges. I am just the woman he wintered with. I suppose you'll be heading north to the Bighorns. Josephine forced the words out, keeping her back to him. She wouldn't cry. She refused to cry. She had found her spine in the snow. She wouldn't lose it in the spring. "To check your summer traps." She heard the heavy scrape of his boots against the dirt floor. She heard him stand. He walked up behind her. He didn't hover. He stepped entirely into her space, his broad chest pressing lightly against her back. The heat of him enveloped her, chasing away the sudden sharp chill in her veins. He reached around her, his massive scarred hands covering hers where they gripped the table. He pried her fingers loose one by one, folding her hands into his. "I've trapped the Bighorns for 10 years. Boone said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble right beside her ear. "I know every draw, every ridge, every creek." He paused, resting his chin lightly on the top of her head. "It's empty." Josephine's breath hitched. She turned slowly in his arms, looking up at him. The firelight caught the harsh, jagged scar that split his eyebrow. It caught the deep lines weathered into his face by a lifetime of brutal solitude. But his pale blue eyes were entirely soft, entirely focused on her. He wasn't looking at a ruined heiress. He wasn't looking at a scarred face. He was looking at his equal. He was looking at his home. "I'm not going north," Boone stated. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a fact. "You aren't," she whispered. "My gear is here. My life is here." Boone raised his hand, his rough fingers brushing a stray lock of dark hair away from the ruined, puckered skin of her left temple. He traced the edge of the scar with a reverence that made her heart ache violently against her ribs. "You are here." He didn't offer her flowery promises of eternal devotion. He didn't tell her she was flawless. He gave her something much heavier, much more real. He gave her permanence. Josephine reached up her small, calloused hands, framing his face. She traced the scar above his eye, mirroring his touch. She felt the heavy beat of his pulse beneath her fingertips. "They will come back," Josephine warned softly. "Or others like them. The world doesn't leave people like us alone." "Let them come," Boone growled, pulling her closer by the waist, his grip unyielding. "We have enough ammunition. We have enough wood." He leaned down. His mouth found hers. It wasn't a gentle, tentative kiss. It was deep, consuming, and desperate tasting of black coffee and survival. It was a claiming. Josephine kissed him back with equal ferocity, her hands tangling in his thick, dark hair. All the shame, all the hiding, all the bitter, lonely nights curled beneath the black veil, burned away in the heat of his touch. She wasn't broken. She was just scarred. and the man holding her knew that scars were just the armor you grew after the world tried to break you. When they finally parted, breathing heavily, their foreheads resting against each other, the silence in the cabin was entirely peaceful. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, an indifferent, wild sound. Let it howl. They were safe. They were together. And the mountain belonged to them. If Josephine and Boone's fierce fight for their home and their unshakable bond kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button right now. Their story proves that true strength isn't about avoiding the fire. It's about surviving the flames together. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss out on these gritty, heart-pounding Western romance dramas. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that scars are just proof of survival. Leave a comment below. What was your favorite moment of their epic standoff against the Bitter Creek miners?